I'm Scott Simmons, editor of the Dope Fiend Daily, and I'm here with Howard Bloom. Howard, why don't you tell people what you've done in case they haven't heard of you?
So you want me to do that?
Yeah, sure. You probably can do it better than I can because,
Well,
you.
no, I'd like to hear your version.
Well, I mean, he ran circuits in the 1970s. He was one of the biggest publicists around for music, and he personally worked with Michael Jackson and Prince. That is pretty incredible in and of itself. He's also an author, and all this began with him writing for the Boy Scouts of America about tracking and camouflage.
That's a partial introduction. So the real deal. Try this. Um, okay, this sounds horrible to say, so you have to forgive me in advance. But Channel 4 TV says that Howard Bloom just may be the Einstein, Newton, and Darwin of the 21st century. It would be nice, there's no guarantee. I started in microphysics or microbiology and theoretical physics at the age of 10. I started accumulating some recognition, small recognition in science. At the age of 12, I co-designed a computer that won Science Fair awards. I was taken to a meeting with the head of the graduate physics department at the University of Buffalo, and we spent an hour discussing Big Bang versus steady state theory of the universe and the interpretation of the Doppler shift. I was tutored privately in outside the box science by the guy who ran the research and development arm of the company that made the valves for the first plane that broke the sound barrier and the first plane that took humans to the edge of space. At the age of 16, I was working in the world's largest cancer research laboratory, supposedly on immunology, but in reality, I was taking advantage of the opportunity to solve what's called the CPT problem, charge parity and time problem, which is that if matter and antimatter are created at equal amounts at exactly the same time, where the hell is all the antimatter? And I came up with a theory of the beginning and the middle and the end of the universe that predicted something that wouldn't be discovered for 38 years, dark energy. And it explains dark energy. And you can go on YouTube and look up Howard Bloom Big Bang or Howard Bloom Big Bagel, and you'll find a 5-minute animation that explains the whole thing. So this is where I came from, Scott. And meanwhile, I felt that my field was mass behavior. And the way I term it these days is mass behavior, from the mass behavior of quarks to the mass behavior of human beings. And there was a form of mass behavior that fascinated me. And it was that form of mass behavior that you see in ecstatic religions, where people rise up above themselves and are taken over by the God and have an ecstatic experience, a transcendent experience for 2 or 3 hours. And that became a subject of utter fascination for me. And eventually, my background, the music I listened to was classical. The popular culture was the culture of the kids who used to beat me up. So I wasn't the least bit interested in it. But I eventually founded the biggest PR firm in the music industry with no previous knowledge of rock and roll and music. Why? Because I was looking for the gods inside of us, which is that manifestation of group behavior, the ecstatic manifestation that I was talking about. I was trying to find my way into the dark underbelly where new myths and movements are made, because that ecstatic experience has everything to do with the birth of new movements and new culture heroes. And I tripped into rock and roll by accident, and it turned out to be the land where the gods are, the land where the ecstatic experience is summoned every time there is a successful rock concert.
Okay, yeah,
and then I went back to my science in 1988.
One thing,
because I became sick.
With it's just one thing, man. Okay, this goes to the music part. I watched a video with you about Michael Jackson, and that really just interested me, how he could get that just potent energy with his work, and even who he was as a person. What do you think the biggest lesson people could take from Michael Jackson was, and what do you think he did for you as a person?
Okay, when I was 10, the 2 things that drew me into science were the first 2 rules of science, which appeared in a book in my lap, and I don't know where that book went. I don't know where it came from. And it said the first 2 rules of science are these: the truth at any price, including the price of your life. And it told the story of Galileo, and it told it as if he was a hero and had courage. It would take 30 years for me to discover that wasn't true. I needed this mythological version of a man absolutely committed to the truth. The second rule of science, look at things run under your nose as if you've never seen them before, and then proceed from there. Look for things that are invisible to you and everybody around you. You see them every day, you don't see them at all. And reveal them and pull them into the light and see them for the first time. Well, that's the rule. The first rule is the rule of courage, the truth at any price, including the price of your life. The second rule, look at things right under your nose, is the law of awe, wonder, and surprise. Michael Jackson was those two first laws of science come alive in a manner I had never seen in my life and will probably never see again. He had a quality of awe, wonder, and surprise that was so genuine, that was so intense, that it was angelic. It wasn't on the normal human plane. It was a step closer to divinity than any other human. And remember, I've met some remarkable humans. I've worked with Buzz Aldrin. I've worked with the 11th president of India. I've worked with all kinds of people. And yet I never in my life ever expected to see from any quarter this astonishing ability to light up with wonder and to see infinities in the tiniest of things. That's what Michael Jackson had. He was the next, if we can achieve Michael Jackson-ness in the next levels of humanity, we will have taken a huge step forward.
That's what I find just so incredible about all that. It's because I as you talked about, like, wonder and like always look at something as if it's been, if you're seeing it for the first time. Yeah, it's so hard to do that sometimes because, like, we'll get jaded. We'll think, oh, it's like this or that. But like trying to, like, once you can break free of that, you can make some really great art.
Right. And I agree with you. I mean, one of my arts is photography. My photography has been shown at Art Basel in Florida, which is the most competitive art festival in North America. One of my friends, a professional photographer, has been trying to get into it for years. When she heard that I got my work in there, and she's been turned down for years, was ready to strangle me. It was intolerable for her. When I was stuck in bed for 15 years, and I bought myself the highest end digital camera you could get at that point. It was 1.1 pixel Olympus, and it had macro features, so you could get within an inch of something and shoot it with perfect clarity. And the world opened up to me. My apartment became a never-ending source of wonders. I discovered that you can find an entire metropolitan museum of strange things just by walking through your own apartment and seeing things in ways you've never seen them before. And then when I finally was able to get out of bed in 2003 and go outdoors, I took my camera, and as soon as I got out on the front, I saw one of the most astonishing things I'd ever seen in my life. The cars were sparkling. That's normal, right? Mm-hmm. But every one of those sparkles, if you went up close to it, was a complete image. It was a reflection. So I started taking pictures of reflections in the windows of cars and the headlamps of cars. It was astonishing. And now I have my Samsung phone, and it doesn't have macro capabilities. It's so much better in certain ways than the cameras that I started with that it's ridiculous. But I'm not seeing things in new ways anymore. I've run out of new ways to see things, and it's extremely frustrating that I'm seeing things the same old way over and over again and not seeing anything new.
I'm actually very curious about, like, okay, with your photography, right?
Right.
Like, that's a new subject to me. You have, like, been involved with a lot of different activities.
But it has a basic underlying continuity with everything else that I'm talking about. The second rule of science is look at things right under your nose and as if you've never seen them before, and then proceed from there. That's photography. At least that's my photography. Because all of these things are about perception. Science is about perception. Poetry is about perception. Michael Jackson's almost superhuman qualities are about perception. And with photography, I can kick you loose and get you to see things in ways you've never seen them before.
Is, is that like the same like approach that you really took as a publicist, where it's like how did you first get that vision of, okay, I know this person is going to be.
Well, I came into the industry when I accidentally got a job editing Circus magazine. And one of the things that I realized at Circus was it wasn't just hits that determined. See, I had a 4-month lead time. So my job was to predict who would be on the top of the charts in 4 months. And in making those predictions, I used correlational techniques. I used the way of thinking I got out of Martin Gardner's Scientific American Mathematical Games section, which had an enormous influence on a whole lot of people. And I applied that to rock and roll. And what I discovered is everybody thought it was hits that made you, put you on the top of the charts. And I discovered, no, it wasn't just hits. It was hits plus touring. And if you hadn't toured in the right way, your career would die because of a hit. You would become a 1-hit or 2-hit wonder, and then you would disappear because the public had no bonding with you. They had never gone through that intense, ecstatic bonding experience of a concert with you. But once you had a sufficient number of people who'd been through that intense bonding experience, that ecstatic experience with you, they would spread the word. So you wouldn't come at them from the top through a radio station programmer. You would come from the bottom. People would spread the word, and people believe their friends about things that they won't believe advertising about. So I learned how to predict what would be on top of the charts in 4 months and how essential touring was to all of this. And I'm getting off the topic. What was the question again?
Oh, it was how did you really pick the hits? I got really interested in hearing that because like I actually didn't connect the touring thing as much as hits and
touring is it. Touring is it. Touring is it. I mean, you need both. But if you were going to do away with one of them, do away with hits. Because with touring, you can build an audience.
Okay, this is one thing I'm curious about. Like, it was call the exact thing. Slipped my mind. It's like, okay, with like all these with all the people, notable people you work with, right? What's the craziest or most humorous story you can get into?
Well, it's not crazy and it's not humorous, but one that Don Arden, who managed the Electric Light Orchestra and a bunch of others, for some reason found me an interesting novelty. So he would invite me out to his mini mansion in the hills of LA. And his mansion was strange because real estate in LA costs a fortune. So if you want to build a mansion, you buy a postage stamp of land and you fill it with your mansion. But the mansion raises expectations of, a British dwelling where you've got acres of land in the back and acres of land in the front. Okay, so I take my rental car up through the snaky hills of LA, west of LA, up to a vine-covered thing you almost cannot see that's a locked gate, and it has a speaker on it. And you push a button and you announce yourself. Now, you expect when the gate opens, there will be this vast estate, huge lawns. No way. There is a paved piece of asphalt big enough for 17 cars. There are 3 2-car garages. In one of the garages is the smallest pony you've ever seen in your life, a little miniature Shetland pony, just to get across the idea that this is a British-style manse. But he's in the garage, for God's sakes, chewing hay in a little corral. And you go up to the big wooden door, and that's twice as tall as you are, and you ring the bell, and the door opens, and 2 giant dogs, bigger than the pony, come charging at you, and the door has been opened by an extraordinarily beautiful woman. So that's Don Arden's place. So one day I was wandering around Don Arden's place, and I was going through the living room. And there was a guy, there were two living room chairs set up next to the fireplace. And there was somebody in an English smoking jacket, one of those silk things, sitting by the fireplace. And now, look, at Circus, I had been covering Black Sabbath. Black Sabbath, one of Black Sabbath's albums was the first album that I ever reviewed. And this person sitting there dozing looks like it might be Ozzy Osbourne. So I walk over and he wakes up and I introduce myself and it's Ozzy. And Ozzy tells me the following tale. First you have to know, once upon a time, Ozzy made headlines all over the world for biting off the head of a live bat on stage. The animal cruelty people were up in arms. They couldn't stand this. So Ozzy said, you know how I became famous for biting off the head of a bat on stage? Well, when I got out of school, the only job I could find was at a slaughterhouse. So every day I was helping feed 1,000 cattle into a room that killed them. And every day I went home crying. What is the price of the life of one live bat against the price of the lives of 1,000 cows slaughtered a day? So it's not amusing, but God, what an insight.
That really is. It's like whenever you think of Ozzy Osbourne, I just never imagined, him crying because of cows being killed. I just never thought about his work at slaughterhouse.
Well, he set up an ecosystem, every band does, in which he could project an aspect of himself that was very powerfully built into him, and that was the dominant hell-bent aspect of himself, the cataclysm attracted sense of himself, right? The Doom Rider sense of himself.
I did get the question I was thinking of initially, by the way.
Oh, go ahead.
It was like, it relates to all of it, actually. How do you really begin to start approaching the human soul, so to speak, like through art and through science?
Well, first I got to tell you a story. And let's hope I don't lose track of where I am. But I'm 16 years old. I'm in my hometown, Buffalo, New York. The other kids loathe me. They've always loathed me. They've loathed me since I was 4 and my mom let me out to play for the first time. And so that means that and I'm going to this small private school my parents were kind enough to find for me where I actually can breathe, which I couldn't in the public schools because I was reading 2 books a day. And that meant I was reading a book a day under the desk. And I never paid any attention to the teachers. And the teachers didn't like that. Okay, so now I'm in a small private school that fits my peculiarities to a certain extent, or is willing to tolerate them. And when it comes to voting for the class president, that's a popularity position. So I'm never going to get that, right? When it comes to voting for vice president, that's another popularity position. I'm not going to get that either. When it comes time for voting for class treasurer, the most popular girl is going to get that. I'm not a girl and I'm not popular. And when it comes to class treasurer, well, the most popular Jewish kid is going to get that. I'm not going to get any of those. Those are all popularity positions. But the school is wise enough to run a lot of its functions using student committees. And student committees actually have to accomplish something. Does the president, the vice president, the treasurer, or the secretary ever have to accomplish anything? Nothing. No, they just walk around with the titles. So when it comes time to accomplishing, these nice white Anglo-Saxon kids and upper middle class Jewish kids want nothing to do with it. So what do? They shove it onto some nerd. And who is the clearest nerd at hand with a haircut very much like yours? No, in those days I was a crew cut, actually. Mine didn't grow like that until I was out of high school. So they pick the nerd. And who's the biggest nerd in the school? Me. So there's a programming committee. Every day starts with an assembly. And the assembly is 45 minutes long. It's at 8 o'clock in the morning. The head of the programming committee programs 2 of those assemblies a week and it MCs all 5 of them. a week. So, the first 2 months I'm terrified because I'm going up in front of an audience of 350 people every single day, and stage fright is serious business. And then I get so used to going out on stage that it's like breathing. Okay, the juniors come to me and they say, we're having a dance. Could you advertise it for us? Now, they don't understand the irony of what they've just said. If there is a social gathering of any kind among my peers in Buffalo, New York, I am cordially invited to stay as far away as possible, preferably Cleveland or Albuquerque. If there is a dance, I am not welcome, period. And yet they want me to advertise their dance? Okay, well, I swallow the irony. I put a record on the turntable. I don't even remember what it was. I get up in front of the audience. Now, I can't dance. Every 2 years, my parents would make an effort to turn me into a human. And it never worked. And one year, their big effort was to send me for a whole year to dance class. And I was so incompetent at dancing that no girl would dance with me, plus no girl wanted to dance with me anyway, even if I were competent. And only the instructors would dance with me, and they would regret it because I would break their toes. And I'm about to dance, and I can't do the boxtrot, the box step, the foxtrot, the waltz, anything. So I start dancing, and which means I'm moving my body to the music in a way that even I can't see what I'm doing. And I see a strange thing happening with the audience. The girl who hates me most in the school, her face is melting. Her eyes are widening. Her pupils are dilating. And that same thing begins to happen to all 350 people in the audience. Then it's as if there's this giant blob of energy, this amoebic blob of energy, in which they are all participants and which envelops all of them. And that energy reaches a pseudopod, like a tunnel, out to me. And I have an out-of-body experience. I see this whole thing from the ceiling. And I see that energy go up to somewhere around my head, become utterly transmogrified, and flow back down through the pipe of me to the audience again. And it's a continuous reverberatory feedback loop. Now, when I'm finished with this 3.5-minute performance, the strangest thing happens. The students do something they have never done for a homecoming queen. They have never done for a football captain. They have never done for anybody. It simply hasn't happened in the school in my time there. But they do it as if they practiced it all their lives. They come flooding down to the lip of the stage. They pick me up off the proscenium. They put me on their shoulders. They carry me out of the auditorium, and they carry me up the pathway leading to the building that houses our classes, and they don't let me down until we get to the class building. So I have an experience of this ecstatic thing that I've been looking for all my life. It's just in my processing, I never realized that's the experience I was looking for. It's taken me into the last 10 years to realize that. So we can be very slow at processing experience. So when I go into the rock and roll business, I start, because I'm at circus and because my audience are teenagers. I never had a teenagerhood. I never had a childhood. So I'm suffering teenagehood deprivation. And I throw myself into identifying with these teens for all I'm worth. And what I discover is they want the story of how any artist, pick one, Elton John, went from being an ordinary kid just like them to being a star. So they can identify with taking those stairs up that the artist took. So those are the stories I go for when I'm doing a feature on Elton John or a feature on Alice Cooper, how they got from being ordinary kids to what they are today. And then when I found the biggest PR firm in the music industry, I realized that if you're an artist and you sit down at 2:00 in the afternoon in front of a blank screen, you're Steven Tyler from Aerosmith, for example, and you look at that blank screen and you go, I can't write a lyric. I may be on a deadline, but I've never been able to write a lyric in my life. You forget about all the other lyrics that you wrote. And then if you start typing, a strange thing happens. Words start coming through you. the lyrics are coming automatically as that dance came from me in front of that audience. And
All right.
okay, you're Steven Tyler of Aerosmith. Your album is due in a few months. You haven't got enough songs yet. You sit down at 2:00 in the afternoon in front of a blank piece of paper. In those days, it was paper, not a blank computer screen. And you stare at it, and you know in your deepest heart you cannot possibly write a lyric. You wonder how you have ever written a lyric in your life. And then you start writing, and words start coming through you. And by 4:00 in the afternoon, there's a lyric in front of you. And once or twice in your life, if you are really lucky, a lyric comes through you that is so perfect, it feels like it wrote itself, but it was simply using you like a pen. So I slowly realized, it took me years to realize, my task was to find the gods inside of you that wrote that lyric. And when you go on stage, you have an experience like the experience that I described when I was 16. Something takes you over, you feel the audience melting, you feel their energy coming through you, you have an out-of-body experience, you are danced by forces bigger than yourself for 70 minutes on stage, especially if you're a truly charismatic performer, like Prince or John Mellencamp, or in a very, very different way, Michael Jackson. These three people are always connected once they got on stage, but connected to what? So my job was to find the gods inside of you that danced you like a marionette on stage. And my technique, it took me years to develop it, was to insist that if you were going to work with me, I get to spend between 1 and 3 days with you alone, no wives, no assistants, no managers, no intercessors of any kind. And my job, I was going to study you for 6 weeks minimum before I came out to see you. I was going to see you in your own environment, and the environment that spoke the most about who you are. And I was going to get to the gods inside of you. I was going to find the deepest soul inside of you, the passion that writes your songs, the passion that dances you on stage. And that was the goal. But it took me years, Scott, to develop that technique. And there's something about processing. It can take you decades to process something. And then once you processed it once, if you put in a few more decades, you can process it all over again in a whole new way. And processing, getting the verbal mind to catch up with what the visceral mind knows and does automatically, is a tricky proposition. It's a task, and all of this relates to poetry, because poetry is reaching into that visceral realm and putting together a bunch of symbols that get across a sense of that visceral experience. So poetry comes before processing, and processing comes before verbalization, and verbalization comes before science. But they are all part of the same process, the kind of process that's alive in my fucking photography. Look at things right under your nose as if you've never seen them before, and then proceed from there. Expand the envelope of human perception. Michael Jackson expanded the envelope of human wonder. My other artists have not necessarily expanded the bounds of human perception, but Albert Einstein did that. Maxwell did that. A whole bunch of scientists over the course of 250 years have expanded the envelope of human perception.
This is one question I have for you. It connects this and like a part of the Lucifer principle I was trying to like get into and really read, but it's just something I'm curious about. Is all of this like with that expression, right? Does that all tie into the meme?
Yeah, it all ties into memes. Okay, what are memes? Richard Dawkins, who was considered by many a genius, he's sort of the god of a field that I have been heavily involved in, evolutionary biology and evolutionary psychology, says that one of the cosmos' most astounding inventions is the invention of a genome, of a string of molecules that reproduces itself. And genomes reproduce themselves initially in the seas for the first 1 billion to 2 billion years of life on this planet. They use the medium of the ocean to frantically mass produce, narcissistically mass produce copies of themselves to replicate. So those, says Dawkins, were the first great replicators. But then there sprung up on the land a new species, a species with consciousness and the ability to articulate. And that pool of consciousness that comes from having 8 billion people on the planet at a time, all interchanging thought in some way or another, that pool is as ripe for a replicator as the ocean was for the replicator of DNA. And that replicator, says Dawkins, is the meme. The meme is an infectious idea. Once they are born, ideas compete. Most ideas die in 2 days. You can't even remember some of them 20 minutes after you've thought them up. But some memes go from mind to mind to mind to mind, and they have claws with which to keep you. For example, Christianity says, all of this may sound ridiculous to you, but in order to get to the kingdom of heaven, you have to have faith. In other words, you have to set aside all of your rational powers and simply submit to Christianity. Now, has this done Christianity any good? Well, once upon a time, a carpenter from Nazareth, a hick town in the wilds, walked to Jerusalem because he was convinced that every year the Jews at Passover put out an extra cup for the prophet Elijah, who will herald in the Messiah. And why did Israel need a Messiah? Israel needed a Messiah because it has been conquered by imperialist forces and colonialist forces 4 times: the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Romans, and the Muslims. And so we are in perpetual need of a savior. Well, so it's a very savior-oriented time, the Passover feast. There's that extra cup for Elijah at the end of the table at all times. Jesus was certain that if he went to Jerusalem and celebrated Passover there, that the Messiah would come, the Savior would come. It didn't work out that way. What he predicted, the Savior will come, sorry, didn't come true at all. Instead, he ended up crucified. And then his followers, the ones who stuck around, said, he'll be back. He'll be back any minute with the kingdom of heaven that he predicted. They waited for it to come tomorrow. It didn't come tomorrow. They waited for it to come next week. It didn't come next week. They waited for it to come next month. It still didn't come. Finally, they put it off to the new millennium. So Jesus made a bunch of predictions. Now, in science, if you make predictions and they fail to come true, you discard your hypothesis and go to work with a new one. Religion is different. Religion is a meme, and memes have hooks. They have ways of holding onto you. And so even though Christianity is a failed religion in the sense that it has failed in all of its predictions, it is the most successful religion on the planet. Why? It started as a meme in the mind of one man, Yehoshua, Jesus of Nazareth, and it infected 12 apostles. That was the beginning of its spread. And it had the luck of attracting a guy whose father was a citizen of the Roman Empire. Yes, he was Jewish, but he was a citizen of the Roman Empire, who'd grown up in a big commercial city on the major trading routes of Rome. He was not a hillbilly like Jesus and the apostles, not at all. He was part of the major flow of Roman civilization. And he started out by being so obsessed with Christianity that he was prosecuting it and persecuting it. And he was on his way to Damascus to wipe out a Christian community. And you know the story. He was swallowed by a big light. He was knocked off his ass, which means his donkey, not his derriere. And he had a vision in which he reinvented Christianity. He invented a whole new religion around Jesus. And in the new religion, there was original sin. Jesus was here to give up his sacrifice in order to absolve us of our sins. All we really had to do was believe. It had nothing to do with predictions anymore about the coming of the kingdom of God. So that meme has been extraordinarily successful despite all those predictions that didn't come true. How? Among other things, Dawkins points out that meme hook of, okay, this is impossible to believe, but you have to believe it or you're not getting into the kingdom of heaven. You're not getting into heaven when you die. Turned out to be very persuasive. So Christianity is now the largest religion on the face of the planet. It's a meme. It took advantage of this global pool of minds and emotions, a global pool of passions, in order to use those passions as a lighter fluid and put in the right match and bring fire to all of them. The fire of Christianity. And what am I doing? You know, I've written these 7 books. I'm writing my 8th book. I've been on a lifelong mission. The rock and roll stuff was a vital part of it. And I'm trying to bring whole new perceptual lenses to humanity. I'm trying to be significant in the realm of means by giving you new tools with which to see your reality. Will I succeed? The odds are grossly against me. The odds are 8 billion to 1 against me, because only a tiny number of us become the Einsteins and the Newtons and the Darwins and the Freuds. A tiny number of us. And most of us are forgotten once we die. So now there's a Howard Bloom Institute. It's almost a year and a half old. And it's there to perpetuate my ideas when I croak. Why? Because I've dedicated my whole life to giving humanity new lenses with which to see, to surprising you with the real nature of what's under your eyes every day.
I'm curious, like, okay, with the Howard Bloom Institute, right? If there's like just one message you could turn into into a meme, what do you think the biggest core message you'd want to spread to your audience would be?
Well, I'm going to get it out of the computer. Bear with me, because it's really the ultimate message. And one quick one while I'm getting this is new ways of seeing lead to new ways of being. In other words, new perceptual lenses can actually change the nature of reality. Okay, here's the bottom line one, and this is being set to music right now. Since there is no God, it is our job to do his work. God is not a being, he is an aspiration, a gift, a vision, a goal to seek. Ours is the responsibility of making a cruel universe turn just, of turning pains to understandings and new insights into joy, of creating ways to soar the skies for generations yet to come, of fashioning wings with which our children's children shall overcome, of making worlds of fantasy materialize as reality, of mining and transforming our greatest gifts, our passions, our imaginings, our gains, our pains, our insecurities, and our lusts. This is the work of deity, and deity is a power that resides in us. So we are the slow crawl toward the arms of God. In perfecting our own societies, we are bringing that divine thing into life, an insubstantial thing, the flickering flame that comes from memes. And this is serious business. We are the only creatures, so far as we know, on the cosmos doing this. We are the cosmos using us as a mirror with which to reflect herself, just the way she used DNA as a mirror with which to reflect herself.
It's a very great message. Like, this is, okay, one thing I'm curious about, with like, it's something in your book. It's like with the superorganism, right? It's like, how long did it take you to really process like that force?
Which force is that, Scott?
It's like that, it's that large interconnected thing between people.
Right. Yeah, I mean, our cultures are all interwoven. Is just sometimes we focus on how they're distinguished from each other, and we get nationalistic and put up barriers. But we're doing something that's profoundly stupid because, in fact, we are interconnected whether we like it or not. The Japanese, back in the 800s, used to admire the Chinese tremendously. So for 200 years or so, they would send people to China, and the people to China would come back with the things going on in China, and they would ape China to the best of their ability. For example, well, And then they would become insular. And they would believe that everything that they had created themselves, not realizing, not remembering. These were all Chinese knockoffs of Chinese technology. For example, the Japanese went into one of these insular nationalistic periods, setting up barriers and claiming that everything that they'd ever invented was theirs. They'd invented it around 800 AD. Between 800 AD and roughly 900 AD, the Chinese invented something new, the chair. The Japanese missed out on that invention because when that invention was being popularized, they were closing themselves off, convinced they had invented everything good that there ever was. So to this very day, Chinese sit on mats, or Japanese sit on mats on the floor to eat because they never imported the chair. So no matter how nationalistic we are feeling, no matter how much we feel that our culture has made the only unique contribution that counts in the history of humankind, we are all interconnected. There is a vast, what Teilhard de Chardin called a noosphere, a sphere of self-awareness enveloping this globe. Once upon a time, the biggest thing going was the biosphere. Now it's that pooled, interconnected batch of knowledge in which, look, your brain is 100 billion cells. Not a single one of those cells has any idea of what the big picture is. Not a single one even knows your name. And yet, when you put that 100 billion together, all of a sudden, you have a Scott Simmons. What? How did that come about? Well, you and I are cells in a global brain. And we are not aware of the larger personality of the noosphere that we are creating. But we are like individual cells. The collective brain depends on us to thrive. I mean, you know, you can die and be replaced. Your body replaces something like 200 billion cells, just kills them off and replaces them every single day. But does Scott Simmons disappear because of the loss of those 200 billion cells? Not a bit. So the universe would not mourn if you and I were hit by a meteor right now. But we are neurons in a collective tissue, a collective brain, a collective envelope of perception, a collective envelope of mass emotion. And superstars becoming icons, I mean, my job was to find the validity in the life of the artist and to show that to the press so that the public would know it. The truth about the artist, Scott, not some fantasy, not some image, not some artificial mask. And kids could relate to those stories of the artists and they could grow on them. That is, you know how a trestle, or you grow a tomato plant on a trellis? So my stars, I took them and made sure they became trellises on which kids could grow. I knew that if we did our job right, these artists would, the kids would be buying posters of these artists when they were 12 and 13 years old and hanging them on their bedroom walls. And they would be using these, my artists, as role models, valid ones, because you have valid stories of who they were and how they came to be for the rest of their lives. So when I got out of bed, you know, from 1988 to 2003, I was in bed. And I finally got out of bed and I'd heard about this place called the Tea Lounge around the corner from me, but I'd never been able to see it because I couldn't get out of my bedroom. So now I was capable of going to the Tea Lounge. It had been 15 years since I'd last been involved in the real world. And I was certain that people had forgotten my two most important artists, Michael Jackson and Prince. I was terrified because they're part of my flesh and my fiber. They're part of my heart. They'll be part of my heart for the rest of my life. They're part of my identity. And so I walked into the Tea Lounge and I, at the first opportunity, mentioned Michael Jackson and Prince, certain that these kids would know nothing about them. And their jaws dropped, Scott. They said, Michael Jackson and Prince formed my life. Well, that's what I was after, was to take the valid stories, the real stories of these artists and use them so that you could begin to articulate part of yourself that up until then had seemed crazy, insane, and wordless, and use them to articulate that part of yourself and use them as a compass, a guide for the rest of your life. It had worked. Was it nefarious? No, it was truth. It was the rawest form of truth that I could achieve. And every time one of these extraordinary artists opens their mouth on stage, a truth is coming through them that's bigger than they are. They are the instruments. They are the tongues of the subculture that gathers around them. They are the voices of that subculture in their stance, in the way they stand on stage and use their muscles. They are making the most important statement on behalf of their subculture they will ever make. More important than any words, more important than any stories. How this business of communication via stance and the stance of a group, the way you stand, the way you hold yourself, how that works, I have not figured out. But that's one of the mysteries. I'm 79 now. I'm doing, as you know, 1,260 vibrational plankings a morning. I'm walking 6 miles a day. And if I get another 20 years, which is highly unlikely, I'm going to continue processing this stuff and trying to figure out these inarticulable connections, like how mass emotion works with mass perception, how they're part of the same thing, how they work with the transcendent emotions that are evoked by rock stars, where icons fit into all of this. When I got a chance to go into popular culture, I knew nothing about it. But it seemed like a chance to go into the dark underbelly where new myths and movements are made. And the formation of myths and movements is absolutely fascinating to me, and its relationship to the ecstatic experience. So this was an opportunity for a form of field work no scientist I knew of before me, and no scientist that I know of since, has ever had the opportunity to explore like the way Margaret Mead explored the Samoans and was eventually named a Samoan chief, because her way of understanding the Samoans was to become one with all of her heart, all of her soul, all of her musculature, with everything. That's how she came to understand them. And she did it so brilliantly, they named her a chief. They don't name women chief. They, especially foreign women. And they named her a chief. Well, that was my job, to become a chief in a world I did not know, the world of rock and roll, so I could understand that dark underbelly where new myths and movements are made. And in the process, I had to make new myths and movements. I worked with a whole bunch of them. Yes, you have a question?
Yeah. It's just one thing I have to ask. It's because the scene that I'm involved with, it's because with literary scene, like the beats are huge. Like I read them when I was a teenager.
Amazing.
Like, but did you have any favorite beats, or like how did that generation like?
Well, Lawrence Ferlinghetti and what's his name, Allen Ginsberg. My my AOL name, and AOL is the only email address I use, is Howl, Howl. That's because of Allen Ginsberg's poem, Howl. And Ferlinghetti I found to be magical. And there's a whole long story about them. It's in How I Accidentally Started the 60s. One of my books.
Like, I also like one I always liked was Jack Kerouac.
Well, Jack Kerouac had an enormous influence on me. When I was a junior in high school, I was determined to drop out, buy a motorcycle, and go to California. And I was inspired completely by Jack Kerouac and Allen Ginsberg. I had a few small problems I was overlooking. I didn't have the money to buy a motorcycle. I didn't have a driver's license. I didn't know how to ride a motorcycle. I didn't have any source of money to support me on the road. I was determined to do it. It terrified my parents. The phrase dropout had not been coined yet, Scott, if you can believe that. There was no word to justify what I wanted to do. Well, they finally convinced me with the help of my English literature teacher to stay in school. How? The English literature teacher said, look, you want to drop out of school, fine. I'll get you a job at a lumber camp in Oregon. Now, did I really want to spend my time with a bunch of people twice my size and all of their armpit odors? That wasn't what I was after. I was after adventure, discovery. And the thought was so dismal of the lumber camp that I dropped the idea and continued and graduated.
I can imagine why. Like a lumber camp does not exactly sound like fun.
No, it doesn't sound like
Like,
fun at all.
so how horrified were your parents whenever you mentioned like dropping out? Like I have to know.
Oh, it was my poor parents. I'm surprised my stress systems didn't drop them on the spot. They were horrified. And then when they heard I dropped out of Reed College in Portland, Oregon, they were on vacation, on a dream vacation. They had always heard of the Fontainebleau Hotel in Florida and Miami, and they wanted to stay there. So there they were at the Fontainebleau Hotel, and they got a call from me saying I've dropped out of school. They were so horrified, Scott, that they got on the first plane they could find to Portland. They were there, it felt like within hours. They decided, okay, we will send him to the best psychiatric institute in Portland, Oregon to see if he's insane. And so I went through 3 days of psychological testing, Rorschach tests, TATs, all of that stuff. And then on the third day, the head of the institute pulled me into his office. And he said, look, you're borderline psychotic, so I could easily hospitalize you. But in reality, you are the sanest person I've ever met in my life, and I wish I were you. So I'm going to let you go. Do what you need to do. It was amazing. So my parents, with that approval of what I was doing from the head of a major institution, decided to take the rest of their vacation on the West Coast, and they rented a car and they drove all the way down to LA or San Diego or something like that. And once they saw a person hitchhiking, and my mom was convinced it was me. And my dad said, no, it can't be him, and sped by me. And it was probably me. It was a good chance it was me. I was hitchhiking and riding freight trains illegally. And I was traveling all the way from Seattle to San Diego.
Oh, wow, what was really with trains, right? How scary was that? Like,
I didn't realize, Scott, I'm a very optimistic person. So one day I went into a train yard. I first of all had to find out where in the world the train yards are, because they're not where you'd think they are. They're not in the city, really. So I'd hitchhiked to I was in San Francisco, and I was looking for a train yard in San Francisco, and I found something train related, and they said, no, we don't do that here, because I was looking for a train to Buffalo, New York, and to see my parents, who I hadn't seen in a year. And they said, you're going to have to you're going to have to go over to Oakland and Berkeley, and there's a train yard over there. Well, if I remember correctly, I had hitchhiked in from Berkeley to San Francisco to find the train yard. Now I had to hitchhike back across the bridge to find the train yard. And when I found the train yard, I found a boxcar. I couldn't see any empty boxcars. I asked around and said, which train is headed for Buffalo? And they said, Buffalo, are you kidding me? To get to Buffalo, first you have to go to Starkey, and then it was a whole bunch of cities, Rosedale, a whole bunch of places I'd never heard of before, railroad yards. And so I looked for an empty boxcar, and I couldn't find one. And so I went up on the roof of a boxcar, and I planted myself there. Now, Scott, if that train had started up and hit 20 miles an hour, that would have been the end of me. I would have been finished. So a railroad worker saw me, said, what are you doing up there? I explained that I was trying to get to Buffalo. And he said, you're going to kill yourself up there. Come down here and find a better car. So I found a lumber car, a car where I had to stand on the entire trip. And I took this train all the way around the San Francisco Bay, 70 miles to the other side of the bay, that I'd hitchhiked from. And I got on a train there to Starkey, and railroad men along the way explained to me how dangerous this stuff was. It was a miracle I survived on that lumber car because there were no shock absorbers. And when the train is going 60 miles an hour, it's bouncing up and down frantically. And staying there, you know those little hockey things on little pieces of cellophane, and you turn on the board and it vibrates, and the little cellophane-based pieces go skittering around the board. Well, that's what I was on that 3-foot strip of empty territory that I was standing on that lumber car. It is a fucking miracle I lived through that experience. But as I said, I'm an optimist. So I just kept going.
That is crazy to think about, like, especially standing for like a 70-mile-an-hour train ride. Like,
well, sitting was even worse. I mean, I couldn't sit because there wasn't enough room on this particular car. The only thing I could do was stand. But then eventually at, oh God, I forget the name of the town, Stockton, I think it was. I had to get a train to Salt Lake City, to Starkey, which is 15 miles outside of whatever it's called, Salt Lake City. And I met a guy who was also traveling on the train illegally. And he had gone to Bible college in Kansas or Nebraska or something like that. And then Martians had started to contact him through the fillings on his teeth and give him messages. And then the CIA had found out about him and was tracking him. So he was fleeing from the Martians and the CIA. That's why he was traveling. But he was extremely sweet to me. And he found me a coal car and put me in it. Now, a coal car, this particular kind of coal car, has a steel rib that runs down the center from the front to the rear. And it has 6 giant flaps, iron flaps, so that when you get to your destination and you want to empty the coal, you open these 6 flaps and the coal comes pouring out. And one of those flaps was open. That was the flap that my friend being chased by Martians and the CIA, that was the train he chose for me. And when I got into the car, he lifted the flap that was open, that I'd gotten in through, and took the lever that closed it and shut it completely. So on this, I tried sitting on this coal car, and that was impossible because you were being bounced 3 feet in the air every few seconds, and you were landing like a sack of potatoes again. Eventually, your bones were going to break. So I had to stand. Now, because it was a coal car, it was filled with coal dust. And because of convection, the coal dust was being sucked up to the front of the car, down along the ground, the base of the train, and then it was being whipped up over the sides of the train, and then it was being whipped back at 60 miles an hour. So that meant I was standing, while I was standing, I was being sandblasted by this black coal dust for 7 hours or something like that. And then finally, when I got to Starkey, the railroad dicks found me. Now, the railroad police were very lenient in California because California had a labor problem. They needed people to pick the fruit and the vegetables. So they let people ride on the trains even though they weren't supposed to, and it was illegal. They had no such compunctions in Starkey. They said, either you get off this train or we're going to arrest you. So I had to get off the train. When I got off the train, I went to a fuel station, a gas station, to find a bathroom. When I looked in the mirror, I was horrified. I was completely black. My face was all black with the red rims around my eyes because I'd been sandblasted with my eyes open for something like 7 hours. And I tried washing the stuff off. It wouldn't wash off. It wouldn't wash off. So I went to the airport and asked my parents to wire me the money to get on a plane, which was a huge defeat. And in the airport, you can imagine what people thought of me. I was barefoot. I'd been barefoot for 6 months. I was wearing jeans and a baggy white sweater so that when I was by the side of the highway, you could see me and wouldn't run me over. I was carrying a pack that included my sleeping bag, a giant Clorox jug filled with Kool-Aid, and a bunch of bread and Italian sausages and cheese. And I was black as could be. So eventually, a policeman came over and he said, "You can't sit here," and come to my office. So I went to his office. I told him my story, and he said, "You haven't seen your mother in a year? Get the fuck on that plane." So he let me go back to the seat, and he just made me stop reading books that I was taking off of the book concessions shelves, reading and then returning to their places that I couldn't do anymore. And then another man came up in a suit and tie, and he said, "Hi, I'm the vice president of American Airlines for the Salt Lake City airport. Can I take you for a cup of coffee?" Scott, people were offering me cups of coffee all up and down my road. There were so many kindly people that I ran into. It was ridiculous. So the vice president said, "Look, I'm not supposed to let you on this plane. You know that. You're barefoot, you're black. God knows what you are. But you're going to go with my blessing because you haven't seen your mother in a year, and you better get back to Buffalo and see her." It's amazing the way people were horrified that I hadn't seen my mother for a year.
It really is. Howard,
So,
the timer's gonna like cut off again really soon.
right.
I'll just kind of like end it here, but I really enjoyed this interview.
Well, I enjoyed your haircut because it's the haircut that I used to have.
Uh,
And look what's left of it.
oh, I have a lot to look forward to. Nah, it's been really cool. Like especially the hitchhiking story was crazy. Like I had no idea. Like you
Well,
had to go
read
through
read
all
how
that.
I accidentally started the 60s.
I
Because
gotta check it out.
if you want to be a complete human and you really want to understand the world around you, then you have to undergo as many adventures as you possibly can and as many extremes of human emotion as you can reach. And only then can you be a wise man. And what is science all about? Becoming a wise man and articulating that wisdom and checking it as hypotheses to see if it really correlates with reality.